The Dragon Queen's arrival was not merely a diplomatic event, it was a tectonic shift in the interstellar hierarchy. Her ship, obsidian-scaled and winged like its sovereign, descended upon the neutral skyward of Kepri's cradle with the gravity of a planet falling into orbit. Flanked by honor guards and spectral banners, she walked not alone but with her rare triplet hatchlings, each born under a separate celestial eclipse. Their birth was a symbol, their presence a statement. The galaxy paid attention. Humanity, allowed entry into these high courts only recently, watched from the edges of polished crystal halls and echoing chambers, tolerated more than respected. The Council had extended Earth an observational role, largely ceremonial and far from influential. Their value was said to lie in minor technologies, some quirky adaptive biology, and their unexplainable survival record on hostile planets. Yet no one expected anything significant from them. Not until the banquet. It was a convergence of cultures, feasting dragons, avian scholars, silicon-boned herbivores, and Earth's few meek delegates. It was also where everything began to fracture. The triplets, still young by dragon reckoning but already the size of ponies, were placed in a central ring adorned with gemstone platters and elemental food creations, volcanic bone stew, seared venom crabs, bloodroot tartare. Culinary marvels, prepared by the galaxy's finest. The hatchlings took one sniff, then another. One pawed a plate, hissed, and turned away. The second nudged their sibling in shared revulsion. The third gagged and curled into a defensive coil. A stunned silence crept across the hall. Chefs froze. Servers trembled. Nobles looked to one another, unsure if this was a protest, an insult, or an omen. A low growl from the queen silenced the room entirely. She approached, inspecting each dish. Then she looked to her offspring, tail twitching, eyes narrowing. They whimpered. No food touched. No flame breathed. This was more than appetite. It was refusal. Attempts to appease them escalated quickly. They brought in flamebearers to reheat the dishes. Aromatic smoke was vented into the air. A telepathic gourmet from the Silek hive tried to override their sensory rejection. Nothing worked. The hatchlings began to growl and snap at the attendants. Then they simply lay flat, tired, hungry, unmoved. Behind them, in the less glamorous corridors of the embassy's lower decks, Ren, a human sanitation assistant, was finishing a shift. Their job was cleaning the refuse disposal unit outside the kitchen airlocks. A thankless task? They ate late lunches there, quietly, often without notice. That day, Ren brought leftovers from their own cooking: rice, shredded chicken, a pinch of ground herbs, drizzled with warmed honey oil. Home food. When Ren tossed out a scrap into the compactor bin, it never reached the chute. One hatchling, having slipped away unseen, snatched it mid-air and bolted back down the corridor. Seconds later, the second appeared, snarling playfully. Then the third. They circled Ren, growling in low chirps, their long necks coiled forward in curiosity and hunger. Cautiously, Ren crouched, spooning bits of their meal into an empty lunch container. The first dragonling licked it clean before the second even approached. The third snorted steam impatiently. Ren handed them the remaining portion. All three purred, a resonant bass hum that rattled the nearby walls. Security footage later confirmed the entire incident. A faceless clip spread quietly across the station. To some, it was hilarious, royal dragons begging for human comfort food. To others, it was deeply alarming. The Queen's aides rushed to investigate. The hatchlings had returned to her side, but they refused all subsequent meals again. Their body language shifted. They whined. They looked toward the human quarters, sniffing the air for something lost. The Queen watched them, unmoving. An emergency council convened behind sealed doors. Theories swirled. Had humanity accidentally triggered a bonding response? Dragons, after all, were said to bond only through blood, flame, or shared instinct. But bonding through food? Through kindness? That wasn't recorded. Not in any known archive. The Queen remained silent publicly. But when the human delegation was summoned for review, Ren was notably absent. quietly transferred to a private suite under light guard. Not as a prisoner, but something more uncertain. A variable. In private, the Queen asked her brood only one question. None spoke. But all three turned toward the chamber's vent, a faint scent of rice, herbs, and honey still drifting from the lower kitchens. Whatever had begun in that hallway with a quiet human and a humble meal, it wasn't ending there. The hatchlings grew restless after their unexpected feast. Guards tried to usher them back into ceremonial routines, but they resisted, retreating into sulky postures or pacing the perimeters of their enclosure. They snapped at unfamiliar hands, flared wings in frustration, and made high-frequency whining clicks, vocalizations that hadn't been heard from Dragakind in recorded memory. The palace kitchens tripled their output, attempting every known delicacy from the archives. None were touched. The food sat, growing cold, until it was removed untouched under heavy silence. Wren, still unaware of the storm brewing above, was assigned to waste retrieval rotation again. They walked with the same lunch in hand, oblivious to the eyes tracking their scent through the vent shafts. The triplets had not stopped sniffing the air since their first taste. When the scent returned, they responded like bloodhounds, scraping at the walls, trilling impatiently. Without any formal plan or royal approval, they burst free of their chamber's inner doors, outpacing the sluggish drones guarding the entryway. Wren dropped their container in shock as the trio thundered toward them, not with aggression, but with intent. The smallest skidded to a halt and began to whimper. The middle one pressed its snout directly into Wren's bag. The largest planted itself between Wren and the exit. They weren't hunting. They were waiting. Confused, Wren opened the box again. They extended a cautious hand. The dragons didn't just eat, they inhaled. One nestled under Wren's arm. Another lay at their feet. The third, too large to cuddle, rested its jaw across Wren's lap and shut its eyes. Word of the incident reached the Queen in minutes. She said nothing, only issued a command: observe without interference. Wren, given a seat on a side bench and a tray of refilled portions, began to understand that this was no accident. The dragons were not hungry, they were seeking something specific. Not flavor. Not nutrients. Something embedded in the act. Over the following days, experiments were run. Culinary teams tried to analyze Wren's food. Nutritional scans came back ordinary. No addictive compounds, no biochemical triggers. Copies were made. Federal rejected. Again and again. The hatchlings only ate when the food came from Wren's hands. Not from a machine. Not from a silver bowl. Only from Wren. Heated or cold, plated or wrapped, it didn't matter. They needed the human touch. Wren was brought into the Queen's private hall for observation. Cameras off. No audience. The Queen sat silently on a raised perch while her offspring gathered around Wren like children at a campfire. They chirped. Nuzzled. Lay with chests heaving in contentment. The Queen asked a single question, directed not to Wren, but to her attending geneticist: could imprinting through food be real? The answer was hesitant. Only in mammals. Dragons evolved past that. She remained still. The answer was wrong. Later that evening, Wren, who had only wanted to remain unnoticed, was given formal temporary status as caretaker liaison, a title invented on the spot. The designation made no sense to the High Council, but it wasn't negotiable. The hatchlings would not eat without them. The reactions from the greater court were swift and brutal. Accusations of enchantment, cultural manipulation, primitive sorcery filled diplomatic channels. Some claimed Earth had found a backdoor into dragon psychology. Others feared precedent. If a janitor could bond with royal heirs, what did that mean for protocol? For breeding hierarchies? But beneath the political outrage, something else spread. Footage leaked, clipped and faceless, showing the triplets curled in Wren's lap. One hiccuping. One dozing. One playing with a spoon. The galaxy expected dragons to be warborn, storm-carved, avatars of strength. But in those frames, they were fragile, instinctual, and entirely devoted. The Queen watched those clips in silence. She remembered raising her first clutch, torn away hours after hatching, conditioned by elder flames and sparring pits. She thought of the long silences between herself and her own dam. There had never been warmth. Only survival. She summoned Ren again. No audience, no title, no pretense. She observed as Ren laid out small meal portions for the triplets. Each dragon waited their turn, noses twitching, tails calm. When one tried to steal another's portion, Ren simply raised a brow. The hatchling backed off. No words needed. No fire. After the meal, one of them pressed their head into Ren's chest, humming deep and slow. A sound only a bonded clutch makes in safety. The queen finally spoke, not to Ren, but aloud. What you give them is not food. It is presence. Ren, unsure what to say, simply nodded. The queen rose. Her eyes were unreadable. But something had changed. In that quiet room, where nothing ceremonial remained, a shift had begun. Not in politics. In instinct. And instinct runs deeper than law. The reaction came with precision and fury. Within a solar cycle, emissaries from over a dozen noble dragon houses filed official protests. Accusations ranged from psychological sabotage to ritual contamination. Humanity, they claimed, had exploited an ancient vulnerability, reactivating behaviors long considered extinct in high-blooded dragons. Feeding bonds, once a survival mechanism in the primal age, were now viewed as base instincts, relics that had no place in royal lines. That it had resurfaced through a human, a low-tier observer from a war-scarred world, was seen as a disgrace. The Council of Flame convened. Elders demanded the human be removed from all dragon contact zones. A request to detain and interrogate Ren under cultural breach protocol was filed. Earth's delegation, though politically minor, refused. Their representative, a quiet administrator named Callus, cited the diplomatic non-interference pact. He delivered the message with no flourish. The human remains under sovereign protection. Tensions climbed. Some factions wanted to sever all human contact. Others proposed silencing the incident. But the footage wouldn't disappear. Leaks from palace security continued to circulate. One showed a hatchling dropping a golden ceremonial medallion into Ren's bag and refusing to take it back. Another captured a dragonling curling around the human in sleep, wings draped like a shield. Behind the spectacle, Ren stayed confined, monitored yet unharassed. Not out of suspicion, but preservation. They had become irreplaceable, not for who they were, but for what they represented. The only consistent source of sustenance and calm for the Queen's heirs. The hatchlings refused to interact with anyone else. Attempts to substitute Ren with human volunteers failed instantly. Even recordings of their voice brought confusion, not comfort. The Queen remained still through it all, a statue carved in thought, speaking only when essential. In private circles, nobles whispered of bloodline pollution. What if this bond altered their development? What if these heirs grew soft? Compromised? Rumors spread of other clutches developing similar fixations. One noble accused the Queen of inviting weakness into the dynasty. The Queen said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence had weight. Pressure built until it snapped. A formal vote was called, remove Earth's observer status. If passed, it would exile the entire delegation, end their fragile alliances, and trigger a cascade of diplomatic withdrawals. The Queen broke silence for the first time in public since the incident. Her statement was brief, spoken to the Council and broadcast across neutral systems. If empathy is weakness, then you fear strength you cannot command. The clutch is mine. The bond remains. The vote collapsed before it began. None dared challenge a matriarch with sovereign brooding rights. Even ancient houses understood the cost of crossing a monarch who hadn't lost a war in over 2 centuries. The threat was not implied, it was understood. Still, whispers persisted. Plans shifted from overt pressure to subtle sabotage. Ren was offered bribes to step away, vast estates, research grants, transport to any pleasure world in the outer rings. They declined without spectacle, stating simply that the hatchlings needed consistency. It wasn't loyalty or courage. It was responsibility. The Queen, observing from shadows, began asking her personal guards questions. What was Wren's history? Where were they raised? Who taught them to speak so softly to beings bred for fire? She reviewed records. No military past. No specialized training. Just an ordinary worker from a resource colony, assigned to the embassy through a clerical backfill. Nothing exceptional. And yet, her children responded as if they'd found the core of their world in a stranger's hands. Nobles held their breath for weakness. It never came. The hatchlings, once volatile, became steady. Their temper stabilized. They began understanding boundaries, subtle, nonverbal, but real. They didn't eat like wild beasts anymore. They waited. Saturday. Responded. Learned. One morning, Wren entered the chamber half an hour late due to security protocols. The smallest hatchling had howled for 20 minutes straight, rattling the walls. The moment Wren appeared, all three settled instantly. That moment was recorded. An analyst from the Andrelian Behavioral Institute labeled it a care-based pacification threshold, a trait previously seen only in mammalian imprinting. It made headlines across 3 sectors. In a culture built on domination, a new word began to appear: trust. Not loyalty born of fear, but stability born from care. It didn't erase the suspicion, but it planted a seed. Even those who hated Earth's place in the galaxy couldn't deny the results. The Queen's heirs were thriving, not despite the humans' influence, but because of it. And slowly, dangerously, that truth began to fracture the old order. The ritual date approached with no delay. The feeding flight, an ancient test every royal clutch must pass, loomed large over the palace. Centuries-old tradition dictated that before a dragonling could take their first sanctioned flight, they must first feed without assistance, displaying both independence and strength of spirit. To fail meant shame. To refuse altogether meant disinheritance. The triplets had refused all offerings outside Wren's hands. Time was running out. The Queen held court with her strategists in private, demanding solutions. The finest dragon chefs had attempted mimicry with no success. Nutritional engineers from 6 species tried synthesizing the same flavor and texture. The result was sterile, rejected within seconds. The hatchlings grew restless under pressure. Their scales dulled. Their bodies showed signs of slow malnourishment, not for lack of calories, but for absence of connection. Wren offered to step aside for the ritual's sake, believing perhaps distance would force the hatchlings to adapt. But their absence caused havoc. One dragonling shattered an obsidian gate. Another lashed out at a caretaker and nearly ruptured a fuel conduit. The Queen issued an immediate override: Wren would remain, and the ritual would be adapted. An uproar followed. No ritual had ever been adjusted for a single clutch, let alone because of a human. Faced with mounting backlash, the Queen ignored protocol and chose outcome over tradition. She issued a decree: the ritual would proceed as planned, but if her offspring required Wren's presence to succeed, then so be it. Survival, she reminded the court, is not rigid. It is precise in its purpose, but fluid in its execution. When the ceremonial day came, dignitaries gathered across floating observatories. Hundreds of species watched, expecting spectacle or failure. Dragon custom dictated that the feeding flight be public, not for entertainment, but accountability. The entire galactic sphere would see whether the royal heirs were fit to ascend. Wren stood at the edge of the ceremonial platform, unsure, unarmed, wearing a standard utility vest. In their hands was not a polished offering, but a set of meal boxes, each crafted from the same ingredients they'd used from the start. Simple, precise, and warm. The moment the hatchlings were released from their hold, they rushed to Wren, ignoring the courtiers, bypassing the ornate food piles laid in ritual circles. They stopped in front of the human and waited. Not begging. Expecting. Wren opened the boxes, wordlessly. One by one, the dragons ate. They didn't devour. They paused between bites, sharing space, not competing. They maintained eye contact. Their wings relaxed. Their breaths stabilized. Silence fell over the crowd. The cameras caught everything, each bite, each motion, each act of mutual recognition. It was not dominance. It was trust. After the final portion was gone, the largest hatchling stepped back, stretched its wings, and took to the sky. The next followed. The third paused, looked back at Wren, gave a low hum, and then launched. Their flight was smooth, powerful, coordinated. They circled above the gathered audience once, then soared beyond the boundary towers. The Queen stood, her voice cutting the air like a blade. They have fed. They have flown. Let none question the method. Let all bear witness to the outcome. There was no applause. Only the sound of retreating wings. The fallout was instant. Political factions that had pushed for Earth's removal found themselves outmaneuvered. Holliner's channels replayed the moment on every feed loop. Behavioral scientists called it evolutionary fusion. Some called it the rebirth of primal instinct in a modern frame. Others called it dangerous. But no one called it failure. Wren was offered formal rank in 2 diplomatic branches. They declined both. Their only request, to remain near the triplets. The Queen approved it without hesitation. The Council met one final time to vote on Earth's observer status. Instead of revoking it, they granted a permanent liaison position, attached not to a seat of power, but directly to the royal hatchery, as a cultural bridge. It was an unprecedented decision, made not out of kindness but necessity. What Wren had done couldn't be replicated by any known protocol. In private, the Queen made a single addition to the royal archives, a codex entry labeled Interspecies Empathic Nourishment. The author listed was not a scholar. It was Wren. Not titled, not ranked. Just named. The dragons flew, fed, and thrived. Not through dominance or fear, but from something far more disruptive. Care. Years passed, and the hatchlings no longer resembled the wide-eyed creatures that once curled around Wren's lap. They had grown sleek and formidable, wings spanning courtyards, voices capable of shattering crystal, yet none of their primal majesty overshadowed the quiet bond that remained unchanged. Every off-world visit began the same way, a low hum through private channels, a familiar tone only Wren recognized, and a soft landing outside their small home nestled near the edge of the royal perimeter. Despite their status, Wren never accepted relocation, titles, or ceremonial privileges. They requested space, autonomy, and access to a single garden where Earth crops could grow undisturbed. That request, once considered quaint, eventually became sacred ground. The dragons returned to that place not for grandeur, but for comfort. When galactic negotiations collapsed, when war chants echoed through interstellar borders, or when the weight of lineage pressed too tightly. That was where they found stillness. Their connection had begun as necessity, but what followed became cultural shift. Across species lines, educators, caretakers, and even military trainers studied the feeding flight footage, trying to dissect the intangible. Yet each analysis returned to the same conclusion: human presence altered developmental behavior in the triplets not by command, but consistency. They did not imprint through domination. They mirrored care. Within 3 cycles, Earth's role transformed. Not militarily. Not economically. But philosophically. Human, nurture frameworks were quietly integrated into hatcheries across neutral planets. Not all species adapted. Some resisted, believing attachment undermined independence. Others saw results too valuable to ignore. Dragon clutches once raised in cold precision began receiving limited human contact. Incidents of clutch conflict dropped. Emotional volatility reduced. Flight readiness improved. No single event triggered this adoption. It spread gradually, almost invisibly. One clutch here. A pilot program there. Each success added weight to Wren's example, not as a hero, but a template. The Queen never spoke of that period in political terms. When questioned, she dismissed speculation. They thrived. That is all. But to those closest, her approval became policy. New generations learned to observe before reacting, to listen before commanding. Strength remained revered, but a new layer emerged, temperance shaped by attention. Wren, for their part, remained unchanged. They declined every media interview, refused biographical publishing rights, and returned gifts sent by intergalactic sponsors. They kept a small archive of messages, notes from caretakers reporting breakthroughs, educators sharing first words from speech-delayed younglings, and 1,000 variations of gratitude that never asked for response. Wren read them in the evenings, seated beneath the same tree the smallest dragonling once accidentally scorched. Eventually, a date approached that had once gone unmarked, the clutch's hatch day. Now adolescents, they returned not in formation, but quietly, wings folded, heads low. No audience. No ceremony. They landed in the garden and presented Wren with a set of containers, handmade, clumsy, but sealed tight. Inside, Earth-style rice, chicken, herbs, and honey. The proportions were wrong. The balance off. But the intent perfect. Wren laughed. The dragons lowered their heads, unsure. Wren nodded, tasting the food, then lifted one of the containers in mock salute. They all exhaled, a trio of rumbles that shook the nearby trees. That night, they lay beneath stars like before. Not in a storybook ending, but a quiet continuation. No spectacle. Just belonging. The galaxy changed, but not all at once. Sectors fractured. Empires restructured. Yet the ripple never faded. Care became a variable in strategic development. Some still mocked it as sentimental. Others embedded it into doctrine. But every time a hatchling calmed at the sound of a human's breath, or a warrior hesitated before shouting down a lesser voice, the shift continued. In one distant library, a scholar would eventually record, "The dragons taught us that survival comes from fire. But humans taught dragons that growth comes from stillness." That line was archived, repeated, misquoted, and eventually etched into the training halls of the Royal Broodguard. Wren never asked for that. Never even knew. For them, it was simpler. 3 beings had once refused the galaxy's finest offerings and instead curled up beside a stranger who shared a meal. Sometimes, revolution doesn't begin with defiance. It begins when someone cares enough to feed the hungry, even when no one's watching.